the spring of 1943, the Royal Air Force was at a turning point. The relentless bombing campaign over occupied Europe had begun to expose both the strength and the vulnerability of Britain's air power. Intelligence officers at RAF Benson, Oxfordshire, the nerve center for photo reconnaissance operations, were becoming increasingly concerned about German radar technology along the North Sea coast. Reports from returning crews hinted at new, unidentifiable radar masts appearing on the Danish shoreline. The Air Ministry feared that these were part of an advanced Luftwaffe detection network, a system that could undermine the Allies' plans for air supremacy and the upcoming invasion of Europe. Amid this growing tension, a small group within RAF intelligence authorized a top-secret mission. It was to be flown by No. 540 Squadron, an elite reconnaissance unit operating the de Havilland Mosquito PR.9, a twin-engine aircraft so fast and agile that it was often called the Wooden Wonder. The mission, codenamed Operation Sentinel, was to confirm the existence of these mysterious radar stations, photograph them, and return undetected. Few knew of its existence. Fewer still understood its importance. At dawn on May 9, 1943, Squadron Leader Alan Forsyth, a veteran pilot with over 60 missions behind enemy lines, and Flight Officer Peter Latham, his navigator and camera specialist, prepared for departure. The aircraft, tail number DZ-419, had been fitted with an experimental f.24 aerial camera, capable of capturing unprecedented detail from 30,000 feet. Their orders were simple, but chillingly precise. Depart 0500 hours. Route over North Sea. Reconnaissance sector, West Jutland coast. Return under radio silence. Priority, maximum secrecy. Inside the operations hut, Forsyth studied the briefing notes. He signed his name at the bottom of the mission order, beneath a bold stamp, classified, eyes only. He folded the document neatly and placed it in his flight jacket. A flight mechanic recalled later, he looked confident, but there was something different that morning, quieter. Like he knew this one mattered more than the rest. The Mosquito took off into the pale morning sky, its Merlin engines humming with familiar precision. Within minutes, it vanished into the cloud banks over the North Sea. RAF Benson's radar tracked it as it climbed to altitude, then watched as the green dot faded from the screen, heading toward enemy waters. That was the last confirmed sighting of DZ-419. The crew's assigned route would have taken them directly over the Danish coast, near the fishing village of Thyberon, where German engineers were rumored to be installing a new Freya radar array, a long-range detection system used to spot Allied aircraft. Intelligence had been pieced together from resistance radio reports and intercepted Luftwaffe messages. But there was something about this installation that unsettled British analysts. The site's configuration didn't match any known German radar blueprint. It was larger, reinforced, and possibly experimental. Back at Benson, Wing Commander Douglas Henshaw monitored the mission log. When Forsyth's expected check-in time passed without contact, there was no immediate panic. Radio silence was common on such missions. But by 1100 hours, 2 hours past the scheduled return, the tension in the operations room became palpable. Weather reports showed no storms over the route, and no other squadrons reported enemy contact in the area. It was as if the aircraft had simply disappeared. By afternoon, coastal command stations along eastern England were alerted. RAF Burlington, RAF Leuchars, and even naval listening posts in Scotland scanned the airwaves for any sign of DZ-419. At 1430 hours, a vague transmission was logged by a signal unit near Hull, a weak Morse code pulse that faded before being identified. Its origin couldn't be triangulated. That single entry would later become a focal point in the investigation, a possible distress call, or something else entirely. Among the crew's personal effects left behind in the ready room was Latham's small leather notebook. Inside, on the final page, he had scribbled a line in pencil. All things seen from above take on a new meaning. It was an introspective note, typical of reconnaissance airmen, men who lived on the edge of visibility, documenting the war from silent heights. But for those who later examined it, the line carried a haunting weight. By dusk, with no sign of the Mosquito, the mission was officially classified as overdue, presumed lost. Yet within RAF intelligence, questions immediately arose. Why had this mission, unlike dozens before it, been kept off routine flight rosters? Why had the reconnaissance targets been designated unverified installations? And why, in Forsyth's briefing packet, had one section been redacted even from his own navigator? The official report closed with a simple statement: aircraft DZ-419 failed to return. Last contact, Doggerbank Sector, 0530 hours. Cause unknown. But among those who knew the true importance of Operation Sentinel, it was clear that something more was at play. As night fell over the empty North Sea, the RAF searchlights scanned an ocean that gave nothing back. No wreckage. No oil slick. No trace of the men who had vanished into secrecy. And so began one of the RAF's most elusive wartime mysteries, the secret RAF Recon mission that never returned. The following morning, May 10, 1943, the operations board at RAF Benson still carried the name Forsyth/Latham, Recon Sector D, marked in red chalk. The Mosquito PR.9, DZ-419, had now been missing for over 24 hours. Aircrew and ground staff gathered quietly, glancing toward the vacant dispersal bay where the aircraft had once been parked. There was no wreckage, no parachute reports, no German broadcasts claiming a shoot-down, nothing but silence over the North Sea. At 0600 hours, Wing Commander Douglas Henshaw convened an emergency briefing. The objective was to trace the crew's last known location using any available signals data. Intelligence analysts cross-referenced radar logs from RAF Trimingham and RAF Danby Beacon. The Mosquito's radar blip had been recorded crossing the Doggerbank at precisely 0527 hours, altitude 24,000 feet, speed 370 knots, and then vanished. No trace appeared on subsequent scans. It's as if she stepped off the map, one operator noted in his daily report. Meanwhile, the de Havilland Mosquito itself represented the cutting edge of reconnaissance technology. Constructed largely of lightweight plywood, it was fast enough to outrun most German fighters. The PR.9 variant carried no armament, just two Rolls-Royce Merlin 72 engines and a camera suite housed in the bomb bay. The cameras, experimental f.24 units with 14-inch lenses, were capable of capturing a square mile of terrain in a single frame. On this mission, Forsyth and Latham carried not only standard film but also a prototype infrared filter designed to reveal heat signatures from radar transmitters. The Air Ministry's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit believed this new filter could detect emissions invisible to standard film. That detail, though buried in the mission file, may have made the Mosquito a more significant target than anyone realized. By late morning, Air Sea Rescue (ASR) units had been dispatched. A formation of 3 Avro Ansons from RAF Lutchers began sweeping the Doggerbank area, joined later by a Sunderland flying boat from RAF Invergordon. The sea that day was calm, with visibility stretching 10 miles, ideal conditions for spotting wreckage. Yet after 8 hours of flying, the rescue crews reported only rolling waves and scattered debris from earlier convoys. Not a single sign of the missing aircraft emerged. Then, at 1930 hours, a curious report reached RAF Blyth. A Norwegian fishing vessel, the Anna Marie, operating under Allied contract, had intercepted a faint SOS signal on the emergency frequency. The transmission, in broken Morse, read, SOS. Eyes, in, ice. The message ended abruptly. The captain logged the coordinates, 56 degrees north, 5 degrees east, roughly 200 miles north of the Mosquito's planned route. That logbook entry, later recovered in 1946, remains the only known clue from the night the aircraft disappeared. In London, the Air Ministry's Directorate of Intelligence reviewed the situation. Files declassified decades later show that Group Captain Andrew Telford ordered all discussion of Operation Sentinel to be confined to oral briefings only. The mission's existence was wiped from standard operational records. Even within RAF Benson, it became known only as the flight that never was. To the families, official letters simply read, "Missing in action during routine photographic operations." Forsyth's wife, Margaret, would later recall visiting the base days after his disappearance. A young officer escorted her to her husband's quarters. "Everything was gone," she said. Even his maps, his logbook, all removed. Only his watch and cap badge were left on the desk. It was an uncommon procedure. Normally, personal items were inventoried, not erased. Yet this vanishing extended beyond men. It consumed their traces. As rumors spread among pilots, speculation grew. Some claimed the Mosquito had been intercepted by a German night fighter. Others believed it had been captured intact after a forced landing in occupied Denmark. One persistent story suggested that the mission involved photographing not radar sites, but something else entirely, an experimental installation so secret that even Allied command avoided naming it in official files. In the absence of evidence, conjecture filled the void. Back at RAF Benson, Henshaw continued to press for answers. He corresponded with RAF Coastal Command and even Bletchley Park, asking for any decrypts that might mention unidentified aircraft over the North Sea on the morning of May 9. One decoded Luftwaffe report, dated May 10, mentioned an unconfirmed sighting of fast British aircraft north of Jutland. However, there were no combat claims filed, a puzzling omission given the Luftwaffe's meticulous record-keeping. Either the sighting had been dismissed as a false alarm, or something had prevented the Germans from reporting it officially. In his personal notes, Henshaw wrote, "Silence from both sides is the strangest noise in war." It was a phrase that would later appear in his memoirs, a reflection on the eerie calm that surrounded the loss of DZ-419. The RAF officially terminated the search on May 18. Coastal weather had worsened, and by then, any debris would have drifted far into the North Sea. The case was archived as aircraft presumed lost, cause unknown. No memorial, no explanation, just an entry number in a growing ledger of wartime absences. Yet the unanswered questions lingered, haunting those who had known Forsyth and Latham. What did the crew photograph that morning before they vanished? Why did their radio silence break only with a cryptic phrase? And how could an aircraft known for its reliability vanish without a trace in calm conditions? As the summer of 1943 moved on, the Allies turned their attention to new offensives, new missions, new dangers. But deep within the RAF's intelligence vaults, the file marked Operation Sentinel remained sealed, its mystery quietly preserved. The war pressed forward, but for those who remembered the men of DZ-419, the sea between Britain and Denmark had become something else. A mirror, reflecting questions no one could yet answer. By the third day after the disappearance of DZ-419, the Royal Air Force had mobilized one of its most extensive search and rescue efforts of the spring. At RAF Bircham Newton in Norfolk, the Air Sea Rescue Coordination Center drafted detailed search grids covering hundreds of square miles across the North Sea. Flying boats from No. 277 Squadron were dispatched, supported by Coastal Command aircraft and even Royal Navy trawlers. Each sortie followed a pattern: low sweeps at 500 feet, observers scanning the waves for oil slicks, wreckage, or life rafts. Yet, after days of effort, the radio silence persisted. Not a fragment was found. On May 12, 1943, a signal was logged at the Admiralty Communications Center in Whitehall. It originated from a Norwegian vessel operating out of Bergen under Allied contract, the Anna Marie. The entry recorded a faint SOS transmission intercepted during the night. SOS. Eyes in ice. The Morse signal was weak and broken, transmitted on an emergency frequency typically used by downed airmen. The vessel's navigator noted the coordinates: 56°14'N, 4°58'E, far north of the Mosquito's intended route. The message cut off mid-word, replaced by static. The phrase, "eyes in ice," became an obsession for RAF investigators, though its meaning was never established. Was it a coded distress call? A misheard phrase? Or a final observation from a dying crew? The following morning, the Anna Marie's captain radioed the message to the nearest British listening post in Shetland. Within hours, RAF intelligence officers were at work cross-checking bearings. The signal, they concluded, came from somewhere between Denmark's Skagerrak Strait and the southern tip of Norway, a region heavily patrolled by German naval forces. The area was perilous, littered with minefields and guarded by Focke-Wulf patrol aircraft from Luftwaffe JG-5. If the Mosquito had drifted that far north, its crew would have been flying deep within enemy airspace, far beyond their briefed range. Despite the mounting uncertainty, no Luftwaffe kill claims appeared in German records for that day. In fact, Enigma decrypts from Bletchley Park revealed a curious absence. Entire segments of Luftflotte 2's operational log for May 9th had been redacted or never transmitted. One message fragment, decrypted by HUT-3 analysts, referred cryptically to British reconnaissance over Jutland, subject restricted by OKL, Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. Such language was highly unusual, suggesting direct suppression from Berlin. At RAF Benson, frustration grew. Wing Commander Henshaw requested permission to brief the Air Ministry directly. His memo, dated May 13, 1943, contained a single question: why is Operation Sentinel not listed among active reconnaissance missions for this period? The reply was terse: mission designation withdrawn. No further inquiry. It was clear now, someone higher up intended to bury the incident. Among the flight crew's peers, disbelief turned to quiet resignation. The men of 540 Squadron were no strangers to loss. Reconnaissance missions over Germany carried brutal odds, yet this disappearance was different. There was no combat, no weather report, no warning. It was as if DZ-419 had flown into a blind spot in history itself. One pilot later said, "We used to talk about them like ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, just missing from the record." Weeks passed. Then, in early June, a trawler off the Yorkshire coast recovered a scrap of metallic debris caught in its net, an aluminum panel roughly 2 feet wide, painted in faded RAF sky blue. Stamped on the reverse was a partial serial, DZ-4. The Air Ministry seized it immediately and issued no public acknowledgement. The trawler's captain received an official notice requesting silence, in the interest of wartime security. The search was finally terminated on June 10. RAF records listed the crew as missing, presumed killed. Both families were notified, though without mention of the mission's true nature. Forsyth's wife received a formal telegram and later recalled how the station adjutant avoided eye contact when she asked where her husband had been sent. "He said it was a weather flight," she remembered. "But Alan wasn't a weather pilot. He never was." Behind closed doors, questions multiplied. Declassified documents reveal that British intelligence had intercepted German naval transmissions mentioning recovered English equipment near Esbjerg, Denmark, the same region Forsyth had been tasked to photograph. Yet the message stopped short of identifying the equipment. If it was the Mosquito, the Germans never publicized the find. For a regime known to exploit Allied losses for propaganda, that silence was conspicuous. As the months went on, rumors spread among intelligence circles. Some believed the Mosquito had captured images of a top-secret German radar site, possibly an early version of the Würzburg Reese array or a prototype tracking system linked to V-weapon development. Others whispered that the aircraft had discovered something the Allies themselves were not meant to see. The truth, buried beneath layers of classified files, remained elusive. In the war's aftermath, Henshaw would write privately, "There are losses you count, and there are losses you erase." Operation Sentinel was the latter. It was his only public reference to the mission. For now, all that remained were 2 men, a vanished aircraft, and a mysterious message echoing across decades, eyes in ice. A fragment of static on a forgotten frequency, marking the point where the known history of DZ-419 slipped into the unknown. And yet, this disappearance, silent, unclaimed, unexplained, would later resurface in the strangest of ways. 4 years later, in the marshlands of Denmark, a farmer digging peat would find something half buried in the mud, a clue that reignited the mystery and drew investigators back to the North Sea coast. The discovery came in the autumn of 1947, long after the guns had fallen silent across Europe. In the remote marshlands of western Denmark, near the coastal village of Ringkøbing, a local farmer named Soren Nielsen was cutting peat for fuel when his spade struck something metallic. Curious, he dug deeper and uncovered a fragment of twisted aluminum bearing faint traces of blue-gray paint. Etched into the metal were 2 barely legible characters, DZ. At first, Nielsen assumed it was remnants of a downed German aircraft. Thousands had fallen across Denmark during the occupation. But nearby, he found something far stranger. a fragment of a fabric patch bearing the faint outline of the RAF roundel, the red-white-blue insignia of Britain's Air Force. Alongside it lay a corroded lens housing, the kind used in wartime aerial cameras. The objects were handed to Danish police, who quickly contacted the British liaison mission in Copenhagen. Within days, 2 RAF officers arrived from London under strict instructions to examine the site discreetly. Officially, the investigation was listed as a routine verification of wartime debris. Unofficially, however, the officers were there on orders from the Air Ministry's Directorate of Intelligence. Their internal memorandum, declassified decades later, read, "Possible link to lost PR aircraft, May 1943, Sector Jutland. Maintain operational secrecy." The aircraft in question could only have been the Mosquito PR.9, tail number DZ-419, the same plane lost on the secret reconnaissance mission known as Operation Sentinel. As the officers surveyed the site, they noted its proximity to the Danish coast, precisely 20 kilometers inland from the very area Forsyth and Latham had been sent to photograph. It was open terrain, flat and silent except for the wind sweeping over the marshes. Villagers later recalled that during the occupation, German troops had fenced off the same field, forbidding access. Some said floodlights had been installed, others whispered about trucks arriving at night under tarpaulins. None had known what the Germans were guarding. Among the debris, the British team recovered several small items: part of a navigation compass, a fragment of a radio tuning dial, and a torn scrap of leather later confirmed to be from an RAF-issue flight glove. But the most remarkable find came from a shallow depression nearby, a partially shattered glass plate negative, the kind used in aerial cameras of the time. Though degraded, faint patterns were visible on its surface: curved lines, geometric structures, and what appeared to be shadows cast by tall vertical masts. When the negative reached RAF Benson's photographic analysts, the results startled them. The image, once enhanced and cross-referenced with wartime maps, appeared to depict a radar installation unlike any known German model. Its configuration resembled neither the Freya early warning systems nor the Würzburg-Reese tracking arrays that the RAF had documented extensively. It was something else, larger, with a complex network of cables and what looked like a circular base surrounded by earthworks. The photo bore no date or serial number, but a faint handwritten note on the edge read simply, "Sector D, return before dusk." To intelligence officers, this fragment was explosive. If authentic, it meant that Forsyth and Latham had completed at least part of their mission, photographing a site so secret the Luftwaffe had scrubbed it from their own records. The find also explained the post-war silence. Both sides had reason to conceal what was discovered that day over Denmark. Meanwhile, Danish records confirmed that the Germans had indeed constructed an experimental radar site near Ringkøbing Fjord in 1943. According to post-war interrogations of captured engineers, it was a test range for Liechtenstein SN-2, a night fighter radar system designed to detect Allied bombers. But Allied historians later noted that the described dimensions did not match the system specifications. Whatever stood there, one researcher wrote, was beyond the known radar science of its time. The entire installation had been demolished by German forces in 1944, leaving no trace. As for the recovered artifacts, they were shipped to England and logged into the Air Ministry's restricted archive. The Danish government was thanked for its cooperation in a matter of mutual interest, and the site was left unmarked. Locals noticed that after the British departed, a new barbed wire fence was erected around the marsh. Within months, the ground was reclaimed for agriculture, erasing the last visible signs of the crash. The surviving fragment of the Mosquito, the aluminum panel bearing DZ, was later examined at Farnborough. Metallurgical testing confirmed its British manufacture, consistent with de Havilland's wartime production. Yet, the report concluded ambiguously, unable to verify correlation to DZ-419 beyond reasonable doubt. It was the official line, a subtle but deliberate avoidance of certainty. Internally, however, RAF intelligence viewed the evidence differently. A 1948 memorandum titled Unresolved Reconnaissance Losses listed DZ-419 at the top, annotated with the words, "Potential recovery confirmed, remains classified." Whatever had been found in Denmark, it was enough to close the investigation quietly, without further disclosure. For decades afterward, rumors persisted among locals. Some spoke of British officials returning in the early 1950s, digging at the same site under the pretense of geological surveying. Others claimed fragments of aircraft plating were removed by night. Whether fact or folklore, the secrecy surrounding Ringkobing never lifted. By the time official wartime records were declassified in the 1980s, the original report on the Mosquito's disappearance was missing its final pages. In their place was a single handwritten note appended by an unknown archivist: "File incomplete, refer to Sentinel Appendix, restricted." But the appendix was gone too. The fragments recovered in that quiet Danish field may have answered one question, where the aircraft fell, but they opened a dozen more. Had Forsyth and Latham seen something so sensitive that both Allied and Axis powers buried it from history? And what exactly did the cryptic words, "eyes in ice," mean? As the files closed once more, the ministry's stance remained unchanged, mission outcome undetermined. But among those who knew the story, a chilling conclusion began to take shape: that the crew of DZ-419 had uncovered something far greater than radar. Something neither side ever intended the world to see. In the years that followed the discovery at Ringkobing, the story of DZ-419 slipped again into silence, preserved only in footnotes, whispered recollections, and sealed archives. But history, like the sea, has a way of revealing what was once buried. In the spring of 1947, months after the Danish find, a small team from the British Air Historical Branch quietly revisited the site. Their mission was not recovery, it was containment. What they found would deepen the mystery surrounding the secret RAF Recon mission that never returned. At the time, the war's end had brought with it a new geopolitical shadow: the dawn of the Cold War. Intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain were competing not only for territory but for technology, and radar was at the center of it all. The British had developed the H-2S ground mapping system and the Americans their SCR-584, but rumors persisted that Nazi Germany had experimented with radar systems years ahead of their time. Captured documents hinted at a long-range detection array, tested in Denmark, capable of identifying aircraft hundreds of miles away. The implications were staggering. Within this context, the remains of Forsyth and Latham's mission acquired a new significance. The Air Ministry could not risk public attention. The two-man Mosquito flight had vanished while photographing an installation that possibly influenced post-war radar research on both sides of the Atlantic. Thus, the recovery team's orders were explicit: locate, document, and remove all trace of the incident, without record or recognition. In May 1947, a second excavation began under the pretext of surveying post-war debris. Witnesses recalled men in plain uniforms, accompanied by Royal Engineers using canvas-covered trucks. They worked for 2 days in silence, filling crates with twisted fragments and sealed envelopes. When asked by locals what they were doing, the reply was terse: clearing dangerous munitions. By nightfall on the third day, they were gone. The marsh was left undisturbed, its secrets once again buried beneath peat and salt. Among the items recovered, according to a surviving internal memo, was a partial leather flight boot and several camera fragments, including a focusing ring engraved with serial code F24/13B. One of the officers present, Flight Lieutenant Hugh Mercer, later wrote privately, "The lens glass was fractured inward, as though under intense pressure." But the most disturbing find was a strip of undeveloped film, sealed in a watertight casing. It was immediately taken by intelligence. No one spoke of it again. That film would later reappear in RAF archives, undeveloped, unmarked, and classified. When modern historians requested access decades later, the file was missing, its accession number struck from the record. All that remains is a brief entry in the 1947 Air Ministry Ledger: recovered material, Jutland site, transferred to Mod Section 17. In the official narrative, however, none of this existed. To the families, the truth was less than a footnote. In 1948, Margaret Forsyth received a final letter from the Air Ministry, thanking her for her husband's courage and service in reconnaissance operations. The letter made no mention of Denmark, no mention of the mission, and certainly no mention of Operation Sentinel. The case was stamped, closed, insufficient evidence. For Peter Latham's parents, the notice was identical, word for word. The repetition of language across multiple letters suggested a deliberate template, a bureaucratic erasure. Over time, the memory of DZ-419 faded from official circles, but within veteran communities, it persisted as rumor. Pilots who had served with Forsyth at Benson spoke of his meticulous nature, his reluctance to discuss certain missions, and the way his name vanished from operational records after May 1943. One former intelligence officer recalled years later, Sentinel wasn't just secret, it was erased. That's how you knew it mattered. As Cold War tensions grew, fragments of wartime intelligence began surfacing in unexpected places. In 1952, declassified German reports referenced a British aircraft recovered near Ringkobing Fjord containing advanced optical instruments. The document was written by a captured Luftwaffe scientist, Dr. Otto Lammers, who later worked with British radar teams under Operation Paperclip. His testimony confirmed that the Germans had indeed recovered wreckage, but not what they did with it. "We were told not to record its origin," Lammers said. "The order came from Berlin directly, the Führer's personal command." If Lammers' account was true, both sides had something to hide. Perhaps Forsyth's reconnaissance camera had captured more than radar images. Perhaps it had recorded evidence of German research so advanced it would alter post-war alliances. Whatever the truth, the ministry's silence was unbroken. By the early 1960s, the marsh where the mosquito fell had been drained for farmland. Locals said the land yielded poorly, as if the soil resisted cultivation. On certain cold mornings, when the fog rolled in from the fjord, fishermen claimed they could hear faint metallic sounds underfoot, as though the wreck still stirred beneath the earth. The legend of the lost mosquito became a local ghost story, but one rooted in very real events. In later years, Danish historians who investigated the Ringkobing site found that British diplomatic files from 1947 referenced an unpublicized joint recovery effort in the same area. Yet, the names of the officers involved were redacted, and all technical appendices were removed. What remained were shadows, bureaucratic footprints of something once significant, now deliberately obscured. And so, the official narrative ended, a mission unacknowledged, 2 men unaccounted for, and a mystery locked behind the Official Secrets Act. But decades later, as Britain began declassifying wartime archives in the late 20th century, historians would find that the story of DZ-419 didn't simply vanish. Someone had tampered with the records, removing flight logs, altering dates, and misfiling operational maps. It was then that a new generation of researchers began to piece together what the RAF had long denied, that the disappearance of squadron leader Alan Forsyth and flight officer Peter Latham may not have been a simple wartime loss, but the deliberate suppression of a discovery that neither side of the war wished to see daylight. Decades later, as the Cold War thawed and government archives began to open, historians and aviation researchers turned their attention to the forgotten corners of RAF history. Among the newly declassified materials, one curious pattern emerged: the repeated absence of documents relating to reconnaissance flights in early May 1943. Squadron logs from RAF Benson were incomplete, serial numbers were mismatched, and the mission roster for No. 540 Squadron contained an unexplained gap between May 8 and May 10. The missing line corresponded exactly to the time of Operation Sentinel, the mission flown by Squadron leader Alan Forsyth and Flight Officer Peter Latham. When researcher Dr. Eleanor Trent from the Imperial War Museum filed a request to review the Sentinel file in 1987, she received a terse reply: record withdrawn under Section 3A, National Security Interest. It was a curious classification, one typically reserved not for wartime losses, but for operations that had bearing on post-war intelligence programs. Trent's inquiry only deepened the intrigue. Why would a lost aircraft from 1943 still be under national security protection 40 years later? In 1991, a cache of internal RAF communications surfaced in the Public Record Office. Among them was a letter from Group Captain Andrew Telford, the same officer who had ordered the Sentinel investigation closed in 1943. The letter, marked personal and confidential, referenced sensitive photographic material captured during PR operations in Denmark. In it, Telford wrote, "The material recovered post-war remains of strategic value due to technological implications beyond its time. Recommend indefinite classification. Though vague, the phrasing hinted that whatever Forsyth and Latham had photographed was more than a mere radar array. By the late 1990s, the Mosquito's story attracted renewed interest among aviation historians. Danish researcher Henrik Jager, in cooperation with the Royal Danish Air Force Museum, began a local excavation project near Ringkøbing. Using ground-penetrating radar, his team detected subsurface anomalies consistent with buried metal, possibly aircraft remains. Excavation, however, was halted abruptly after intervention from the British Defence Attaché in Copenhagen. Jager later stated, "We were told the site was environmentally sensitive, but the equipment picked up a perfectly rectangular object, too geometric to be natural." The Ministry of Defense issued a brief statement: "No further exploration of wartime debris is authorized in that area." The Danish government complied. Jager's equipment readings, photographs, and correspondence were archived privately, his research unfinished. Meanwhile, in Britain, a retired radar engineer named Geoffrey Hanley came forward with a revelation. Hanley, who had worked at Farnborough in the late 1940s, claimed to have seen one of the recovered glass negatives from the DZ-419 site. He described it as showing a circular installation surrounded by tall towers, with something at the center that resembled a metallic dome. When pressed for details, he added, "It looked like no German system I knew. It was ahead of its time." His testimony, recorded in 2002, was never verified, but it reignited the debate. What exactly had Forsyth photographed in 1943? In 2010, the RAF officially acknowledged the loss of DZ-419 as a classified reconnaissance mission that failed to return. It was the first time the mission's existence had been publicly confirmed. Yet even then, the report offered no details about its purpose or findings. The phrase, "mission outcome undetermined," appeared once more, the same words used in 1947. The cycle of ambiguity continued. For the families of the crew, the belated acknowledgement brought mixed emotions. Margaret Forsyth, then in her 90s, told a BBC interviewer, "I never stopped waiting for Alan. I thought perhaps one day someone would tell me the truth, where he went, what he saw. But the truth keeps changing." She passed away later that year, her husband's fate still uncertain. Historians today consider several theories. The most widely accepted suggests the Mosquito was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire while overflying a radar site at Thyborøn. Another posits mechanical failure, compounded by the extreme range of the mission. But a third theory, the one that refuses to die, argues that DZ-419 photographed something that neither the Allies nor the Axis could explain, something that vanished with the aircraft and its crew. While sensationalism has clouded the story in modern retellings, serious researchers emphasize one fact: both British and German archives exhibit the same gaps, the same missing pages, and the same reluctance to discuss the incident. For a single reconnaissance flight to vanish so thoroughly from the record is, in itself, extraordinary. Today, on the flat fields near Ringkøbing, nothing remains of the crash site. The land has been plowed and reclaimed, its soil rich with the quiet anonymity of time. Yet on cold mornings, when fog rolls in from the fjord and the wind carries faint echoes across the marsh, some locals claim they can still hear the sound of twin Merlin engines somewhere above the clouds, the last flight of a crew that never came home. The final line of Forsyth's flight journal, preserved by his widow, reads, "We see the world from above, but we understand it only when we fall." Perhaps he was speaking of war, or perhaps of something far greater. Whatever truth DZ-419 uncovered on that fateful morning in May 1943, it remains locked beneath decades of secrecy, a reminder that even in war, some missions were never meant to be found. And so, the story closes as it began, with two men, a wooden aircraft, and the endless expanse of the North Sea, still guarding the secret of the RAF Recon mission that never returned.